Are you easily impressed when you see builds textured like this, or even this? Well, don't be impressed. It was all done using commands from the plugin ezEdits. Commands I will show you right now.
But Meg, isn't that cheating?
Well, it depends on who you ask. I think you can use any tools that you wish as long as you, as an artist, are making deliberate decisions. There's still plenty of room for your artistic input within the command, and you need to be able to apply it creatively. Is that answer satisfactory? Bah! All of these texturing commands within ezEdits do make use of palettes, which is an ezEdits feature also. I have a whole other video where I talk about palettes and how they work and various commands related to those, but just know you will have to be familiar with palettes before you delve into the texturing commands. The first two commands I'm going to show you are the easiest ones to grasp because all they're doing is modifying existing textures in your build. The first texture type is the blend texture, and simply put, this will take any blocks within a given palette and blend them together using blocks from that same palette. As an example, I have a sphere with one corner colored as calcite from this side of the palette and one corner colored as blackstone from this side of the palette. And I also have a third block in there which is red stained glass, just to show that the blending texture doesn't affect any blocks outside of whatever palette you defined. With this sphere selected, I'm going to type out the command ezTextureBlend. Now all of these texturing commands will start with the ezTexture, or EZT for short. Then all we have to do is say what palette we are blending with. So I'm using the ezEdits Grayscale palette, and after that you can enter a radius or how much blending do you want to occur. The higher the number, the more blending there will be, although I think there is still a limit to how much it can blend based on how many blocks are within that palette. So I'm just going to leave it at 3. As you can see, it's only going to blend the blocks within that palette and completely ignore the red glass. By default, this command will only be blending the surface blocks or the outermost blocks of a given area. Now, interestingly enough, it also blended those blocks underneath the glass, but here's the thing, it didn't blend any of these blocks inside of this. Everything else inside of that area turned into black concrete, which consequently is the darkest block in this palette, so it turned everything else inside to that block. If we add the -V flag to this, however, that will also allow for the blending of the non-surface blocks, so then everything underneath of this will be blending as far back as it can. The next command to modify an existing texture is the shift command, or ezTextureShift, I should clarify. This will shift any blocks within a specific palette inside your selected region up or down on the scale of blocks. If I do ezTextureShift Grayscale and I say 1, it's going to shift everything that's inside that palette up by 1 block. And it's just going to make it a little bit lighter because it's shifting it up the scale. The more I run it, the more you'll see it's affecting those blocks and making them lighter. If you wanted to go down the scale, you're just going to do -1 and so forth. And I believe if you did do something higher like 2, it's going to go 2 blocks up the scale instead of just 1 block at a time. So that is the ezTextureShift. It's really straightforward. There is another shift command within ezEdits that's applied to a brush, and that is the palette shift brush. I went over that command in my video about palettes, so I'm not going to cover that here. This is purely for any command that is under ezTexture. But yes, this is the version of the shifting commands that is applied to a region selection such as this, but there are related commands like this that apply to brushes instead of a region selection. The next 3 commands I'm going to group under a general category of geometry-based texturing, which means the outcome of running the command will depend on the actual shape of the object you are texturing. Now, generally, all of these commands are going to work better when you have a solid object versus a hollow one. And just to show you that this is indeed hollow, here we have a hollow sphere, and then this one is solid, completely filled in. Generally, when using these commands, you're going to get a better outcome when texturing something that is solid. And I found this out too when working on one of my actual builds. where I was trying to texture some terrain that I had hollowed out previously, and then I found out that it was giving me a different outcome than when I was trying to texture it before I hollowed it out. So that's just something to keep in mind. If you did want to hollow out an object, you might want to wait to do it till after the texturing is done, because it might not texture the same way or as well if you do it beforehand. With both of these selected, I will go through the first command of these types, and that is ezTexture axisgradient. After that, you're going to enter the mask, or what blocks are you going to be affecting. I only have a single block, which is stone, so I could just enter that. If you had multiple blocks you wanted to cover or mask over, then you would probably do something like #existing, and that would change all of the existing blocks within your selection, so however you want to do your mask. Then I'm going to use grayscale again because it's a nice simple one. Then you're going to choose which axis the gradient is going to go on. I'm going to do Y for sake of demonstration, and this is what it's done as a result. What it's doing is it's looking at each individual row of blocks and applying a gradient to it based on the length of said row. The gradient's going up and down, that's because it's going along the y-axis. If I did a different axis, it would go a different way. Because this one is a solid sphere, it actually has a long row of blocks. So even underneath of this row here, for example, there is a solid row of blocks for it to apply that gradient to. However, over here, some of these rows are only a couple blocks in length because it's hollowed. So this row right here is only 2 blocks in length, so it doesn't have any more gradient to add to that row of blocks. By default, each row starts at one end of the gradient and then goes down the line until it can't go any further. So this row right here, you see it stops at the light concrete, but it doesn't go to the darkest block. If you add the -R flag at the end of this, it's going to activate the relative gradient mode, and what this is doing is for every single column, it's going to make sure it's connecting one end of the gradient to the other. If it has to skip blocks along the way, it will. But it's going to make sure that that first block and last block exist as long as there's 2 blocks there minimum. That's why over here you have the white line with the black line right below it, because it's 2 blocks in length. It's trying to compress the entire length of the gradient into the length that it's given. Here's another example where I have more blocks in a single row than the gradient allows. And in this instance, when I have that relative flag, it's going to stretch the gradient so it's all evenly spaced. You can see a clear difference here with all the different lengths of blocks, how the shorter ones are going to compress the gradient, the longer ones are going to stretch it out so it's all evenly spaced. And that's all with the -R flag. I've swapped the spheres for boulders for these next 2 commands because I think it will show a little bit better. Next, we're going to look at ezTexture ambient. And what this is going to be doing is it's going to be looking at the number of air blocks around each individual block to determine how bright or dark to make it. The more air blocks that exist around a block, the brighter it's going to be on the gradient, or the more bias it will have to one side of the gradient. On second thought, this is an important distinction I need to make. It all depends on how your palette is set up. For the ambient texture, the more surrounding air blocks there are, the more it will bias towards the end of the palette. With fewer air blocks, it's going to be more biased towards the beginning. Whether it's bright or dark depends entirely on how your palette was saved. Let's finish typing this out. Like most of these commands, it's going to have a mask. I could do stone, but I'm going to just do existing in case I want to run it again. Then I'll enter grayscale once again. And this is the minimum. I could run the command like this. Let's go ahead and do that and see what it's doing. The hollow one is completely white, or it's completely on that one end of the gradient. And that is because most of those blocks, or practically all of them, they're completely surrounded by air blocks. Because they are surrounded by air blocks, they're all going to be on that side of the gradient. Now over here, you'll see that only the ones on the edges are a little bit lighter than the ones towards the center, because those edge blocks have just a few more air blocks exposed to them, as opposed to these ones on the flat edges that probably only have 1 or 2 air blocks adjacent to them, because there's blocks on the inside of this object as well. You can also add a radius to the end of this command that will expand the radius that it's searching for those air blocks to determine how bright or dark to make that block. By default, the radius is 3, so it's a radius of 3 blocks that it's searching for. If I lowered it to something like 1, it's going to look a little bit different. By doing that, I actually have a little bit more texture on the hollowed version because that smaller range minimizes the amount of air blocks it's finding. So if I did something a little bit higher, this one is going to only make a difference on the one on the right, but it's going to have brighter edges because it's finding more air blocks with the higher radius. After the radius, you can also adjust brightness and contrast, and these are 2 numbers that I just like to play around with. There's no set way to know what to put in here. By default, both of these values are 0. Before I finish typing the command, I need to clarify, brightness again means the bias towards the end of the palette. Whether it's actually brighter depends on how you saved your palette. If you had it flipped, it would actually get darker. Keep that in mind when you're fiddling with these numbers. Most of the time, I'm just messing around with them and looking at the results to figure out what I want. Just know that brightness doesn't always mean lighter. For sake of example, let's try a brightness of 2 with a contrast of 3 and see what that's going to do. I think that's a little too extreme, so I'm going to try again. This time I'm going to make my brightness 1 and my contrast something like 0.5. Still is a bit extreme. Maybe if I lowered the brightness by -1. Now it's too dark. So it's just fun to play around with though. If you did want to adjust these sorts of things, it's nice to have that additional control within the command. The other geometry-based texture is the curvature texture. It wasn't till I was working on this tutorial that I finally started to grasp the difference between ambient and curvature. For curvature, instead of basing everything off of the present air blocks, it's basing it on the geometry of the shape itself. The flatter an edge is, the more bias it will have to the beginning of the gradient. The more edges, spikes, or corners it has, the more bias it will have towards the end of the gradient. Just like before, whether it's brighter or darker will completely depend on how your palette was saved. It's typed out exactly the same as the ambient texture. We have a mask, and then the palette that you wish to use. Let's go ahead and enter the default one just to see what it's going to result in. So this one by default actually has a little bit of texture on that left hollow one, but again, it doesn't look like much of anything. The one on the right actually does have a little bit more of a gradient here, and you see that ring following that edge of that boulder. Let's try adjusting the radius of this to see what different results we can get. That doesn't look too different, but we can also adjust the brightness and contrast on this to get completely different results. Let's make this a little bit brighter. I'm mainly looking at the one on the right, the solid version. So I'm going to add a brightness of 2 and contrast of 0.5. Let's see what that does. Okay, that was a bit too bright, so I'm going to make it a little bit less bright. And changing the radius will also change how it's going to generate. I think if I make that smaller, it's going to add more sharp lines around the shape of the boulder itself because, yeah, the radius is also determining the shape and the brightness of everything. That's actually kind of interesting. I'm going to make it a radius of 2 instead, maybe with a little bit less brightness. You can get some really interesting patterns using curvature. As you can see for both of these commands, doing it on a hollowed object is pretty meaningless. I just wanted to include that there so you could see you probably want to have a solid object when running these commands. There is no right or wrong way to use these textures. You're just going to have to experiment with both of them and choose which one works best with the shapes that you're working with. Sometimes I find that the ambient one works really well for rocks and terrain. Sometimes the curvature one ends up looking better. You're just going to have to experiment with each and mess around with them until you get something you like. The next 3 texture commands are completely based on lighting, whether it be an imaginary light source or an existing light source that will affect the actual texture of your object. Let's go over the sunlight texture first. Like all of these things, you have to have it selected. It's going to create an imaginary global light within your world to represent the sun. This is not talking about the in-game sunlight. Think of it like a global light source you're placing yourself. I'm going to finish typing out the full command before I explain it further, but it's typed out just like any other command. We're going to enter our mask. I'm just going to do existing so I can go over this multiple times. And then I'm also going to enter my same palette that I've been using, the grayscale palette. And that's the minimum you need for this command. So let's just go ahead and run that and I can explain what it's doing. It's created a basic textured sphere that is light on the top and dark on the bottom. Imagine, if you will, that we have just placed a sun that is positioned directly above our sphere. This light source is a global light, meaning it stretches infinitely in space, but points in a single direction. That position that is facing the sun and is the brightest is at 0 degrees. So 0 degrees is anywhere that your sun is located. The darkest area, the part facing away from the sun, is 180 degrees. This has generated a texture that is on an interval of 0 to 180 degrees, meaning that the sunlight is going to wrap around that 180 degree interval to continue that gradient. Whatever is going to be facing directly away from your global light is going to be the darkest or towards the beginning of the palette, and then whatever is closest to the sun is going to be towards the end of the palette. The additional parameters you can put in this command are similar to the others. There's a radius that we could also enter. So if I did that, it would adjust the radius or the way it's blending together. But after the radius, you can define the light's interval. By default, it is 0 to 180, which is the max. However, if we did something like 0 to 90, you'll see that it's adjusting how far that gradient goes. It's not going to go past this point because that is the interval in which it can create the gradient. If I did 45 degrees, then it's only going to go thus far. That's how intervals work. 0 to 90 is going to most closely represent actual sunlight, but again, you have the option to go a little bit further than that with it. Your interval doesn't always have to start at 0 either. You could start at a higher degree, such as 30 to 180, and in this case, the gradient is going to start at the 30 degree mark and end at the 180. So the first part of the interval can also be adjusted to adjust the beginning of your gradient. There are also some flags that we can add to this command. I'm going to demonstrate this on this wolf over here. They don't have to go in any specific order, but for each one, there is an additional parameter that you'll type out after it. So the first one is simply to pick the sunlight direction. And if you do -L, there is a list of autocomplete options for you to choose from. By default, it's going to be going down. However, you could have the sunlight going up, for example, and then it would be coming from underneath of the wolf. But my favorite direction is aim because it's based on where your player is looking. So that's -L, that's for changing direction. I'm going to go back to this version of it, however, where it's going downward because this will show off the next flag much better. Another flag we can add is the -O flag for occlusion. Now this is basically going to allow shapes to cast shadows onto other shapes within your selection. So it's -O, then we have to select a number for the strength of the occlusion. It's going to be any number between 0 and 1. The higher the number, the darker the shadows will be. So I'm just going to do 0.5 for sake of demonstration here, and we should get a shadow right there, right where the wolf is on top of that rock, which is pretty cool. It's going to look at the fake sunlight that we have that's floating up there, and it's going to cast a shadow based on that direction of light. If I were to do this command again with a more specific direction added, it's going to cast the shadow onto the rock in that direction. The final flag that you can add goes in conjunction with the occlusion, and that's -R, and this will just add a smoother radius to that occlusion. So if you have -R and then pick a number like 2, it's going to smooth it off a little bit. I might have to do a few of these back to back so you can see the difference. So there is one with 2. If I raise it to something like 5, let's see what it does after that. It's just going to smooth off those edges and make it a softer edge. Next, I'll be showing you the pointlight texture. This one is very similar to sunlight, so a lot of the information crosses over with what I discussed there. The key difference is how the light is emitting. Instead of being a global light source that casts light with the same intensity in a single direction, the pointlight behaves more like a light bulb, where it casts light from a single point in all directions for a certain distance. Let me just go ahead and type out this full command. It's going to be just like the sunlight. We're going to start off with easy texture, point light. We're going to do existing. We're going to do the grayscale palette. Following this, you're going to be entering the fall off range. And think of it like the distance away from the light source. By default, your player's position is the light source. So how far away from you do you want the light to spread? That is what fall off range is. Entering 0 for this parameter is going to use the default settings where it automatically picks the fall off range for you, which is the distance between you and the center of your selection. After that, you're going to enter the radius. I'm just going to put a 2 here, and that's again just to adjust the softness or hardness of your light. Next is the interval, and it works the exact same way as sunlight, but just a little differently because we're also considering the fall off. Like before, 0 degrees is facing directly towards your light source, and 180 is facing directly away from it. But the amount of light hitting your object is also determined by the distance it is away from the light source. Naturally, it will be less intense the farther away the object is. And since it's an omnidirectional light source, every object in your selection will receive the light in a different way. Now let's try it on this wolf build over here. This is the result with my player's position being the light source. And again, it's using whatever the center point of the selection is as the basis for the fall off range, whatever the distance is between me and the center of the selection. But we can override that by changing some of those numbers. In the chat, it will tell you what it automatically chose as a fall off range. Here in the last command, it said 119 is what it did. So I'm going to do something much smaller, like 20, maybe 30. And we'll see what this is going to do for us. It's going to light the blocks closest to me, but anything outside that 30 block range is going to be in shadow, or more accurately, the beginning of your palette. The flags for this are very similar to the sunlight texture. For point lights, -L changes the position instead of the direction, because you do have to have this light in a very specific coordinate for it to work. I'm on an older version of this plugin, so it's still showing the north, south, east, west. These don't apply to the point light, which is why it is getting fixed in newer versions. -O will add occlusion just like with the sun. So if you wanted a darker shadow, you would do 1. If you wanted a lighter shadow, you would do something less than 1, like 0.5. And then you can also do -R to smooth off the occlusion just like before. I'll run this command standing here. It's only going to light this little area because I am the light source. You can kind of see the shadows, but not really. It was a really bad spot for it. It's definitely clearer with the sunlight option. There is one more flag with the point light, and that's -F. And what this will do is it will disable all fall off, meaning you'll have an infinite light source spreading in all directions from a singular point. Even though no fall off is an infinite light source, it's still different from sunlight because of the origin of the light. I'm going to stand in between 2 different objects and run this point light command with 0 fall off. Because the point of light is in between the 2 objects, it's going to be casting in all directions from where I'm standing. If I were to do a sunlight command on this same selection, it's only going to be casting from a single direction. The third and final illumination texture command is the blocklight texture, where it will take any in-game light levels or blocklight and base the texturing off of that light source. I'll have to add some light emitting blocks first so I can demonstrate this command. I'm just going to create a basic brush for this, and I'll show you how to set this up if you want to do something similar. It's just going to be a basic sphere brush, and I'm going to set the material to be 1% of a glowing block of any kind, and then 99% air. And then I'll choose a size, how about 8? Sounds good. Then I'm going to create a mask for the brush. And I'm going to be using the Archeon proximity mask. I do have another video where I cover this, but it's basically saying in the proximity around which blocks do I want to place these blocks. So I want to place these blocks in proximity to all existing blocks, and then what distance around the existing blocks, I'm just going to pick a large number like 10 and close that off in brackets and then enter that. So now when I paint with this brush, it should be placing the glowstone around any existing blocks on this build, and it's only doing 1% glowstone and 99% air. I'll kind of put a heavier concentration in one area and then have it get a little bit fainter as it goes up. I have a lot of glowstone placed randomly around the build now. I still think it's a bit too much, especially on the cape. So I'm quickly going to replace 50% of the glowstone with air, just to thin it out a little bit, maybe once more. What I'm going for is that the texture is really concentrated towards the bottom of the cape and then kind of tapers off as it goes up. Anyway, you get the idea. You have your source of light, and now I'm going to run the easy texture blocklight command. And just like before, we have to enter a mask. I'm going to set for my mask 95-0, which is white stained glass. Then we're going to enter what palette we want to use. I will go ahead and do something a little different. How about Enchanted Bright? I have no idea what that looks like or what colors it is, but we're going to find out. Let's go ahead and enter the command and see what we get. So it's going to texture everything in that mask based on the light emitting from those glowstone blocks. The higher the light level, the closer to the end of the palette it's going to be. The lower the light level, the closer to the beginning of the palette it is going to be. So down here where we have a concentration of a lot of light blocks, the light source here is much brighter, so it's going to concentrate on that side of the palette. But as we get farther and farther away, the darker areas are going to go to the beginning of the palette. And over here, you'll see where it's picking up the light levels from the individual blocks more clearly. That's the blocklight texture. It's pretty straightforward. There are some extra flags we can add to this. Instead of doing #existing, I'm just going to do !0, which means the same thing. It's just saying that I'm going to affect everything except air. And let's do that same palette we did before just to keep things a little different from the grayscale. Now the three flags that we have are -L, S, and V. -L is the most useful when you are doing something like replacing all of the existing blocks because it's going to prevent you from replacing over the light source blocks themselves. Running that command is simply going to replace everything except for any light emitting blocks. It has applied the light levels now based on the block light all over the build, excluding the glowstone. And yep, the end rod too also stayed there because I forgot that those existed on the earrings. The -S flag will consider the skylight levels in addition to the blocklight levels. So this is the true in-game skylight levels we're talking about for this flag. Now that time it did replace over all of my glowstone, but that's okay because I can always undo. This area is full skylight, which is why it's all on one side of the palette. Over here in this little shadowy area, you'll see where the light level is a little bit dimmer, and then of course underneath is where it's the darkest and where the shadows are the darkest. But then you also have right here, for example, all of these little blocks where the glowstone was before. So it's a combination of both skylight levels and blocklight levels. The final flag is -V. It's still texturing based on light levels, but only the blocks that have air above them will be changed. So you end up with this really interesting dithered look across the entire surface, which is kind of interesting. Just for fun, I want to see what would happen if we did -V and -S together. So then it's taking on the sunlight levels while only affecting the blocks below air. Ooh, okay. That's where you get the full effect right there, that dithering look. How charming. The final set of textures I will be showing you are the purely generative textures based off of noise patterns. The first obvious one being the easy texture noise. So the texture is not influenced by any outside sources of shape or lighting. It is simply going to take a flat shape of a noise and paste it onto your block structure. It works the same way as all of the previous textures. It will have a mask you need to enter as well as a palette that you wish to use. Following this, you're going to enter a noise type that you wish to generate. Now this can get complex very quickly because following each type of noise, there are additional parameters that you can set. So I'm not going to explain every single one because honestly don't have the ability to explain all of this to you. However, there is this website, which I will share a link to in the description, that allows you to preview and create different noise types within your browser, and then you can use those values and insert them into the command and see what results you get that way, if you wanted a way to preview exactly what each of these parameters is doing. Just to give you an example of a few of the noise types, I don't have an example for all of them, but this purling one in front of me is the default noise type. So this is actually how this command would be written. By default, this is the command that it's going to generate if you don't define anything else. It's going to have the purling noise with a frequency of 0.05. So if you generate this command with the grayscale palette, this is the outcome that you're going to get. The nice thing about using the ezTexture noise generator is it does apply the noise based off of your palette. So you can define whatever colors you want within your palette, whatever gradient you want, and that's how it will apply the noise. I think that's one of the perks of using the ezEdits noise texture over ones from other building tools. Following the same formula with a frequency of 0.05, I have also shown other examples. So the shard, ridged, Voronoi, edge, and cellular, all I did was took this purlin command with a frequency of 0.05 and replaced it with either shard, this ridged, this Voronoi edge, or this cellular. So that is basically the outcome of each of those using that simple grayscale. It just shows you at a glance the difference between how some of these noises can generate. Still, it would be easiest to use some kind of previewer to generate a noise pattern you like, and then insert those values into the command. I'll go ahead and pick one of these noise types with the same frequency of 0.05 and run it on my selection of this statue over here. As you can see, there's nothing crazy about this other than it just applied that noise type to the selection of blocks. Now there are a couple of flags you can also add on the end of this command. The first one being -Z to adjust the scale of the noise. So by default, you'll see how that noise is scaling, and the default value is 1. So if I scaled it to something like 3, let's see what results we get. It appears a higher value will scale it larger, and so if I wanted it to go smaller, I would set a smaller value. If I did something like 0.5, I'm going to get a much smaller scale of that noise type. The other flag you can set for noise texture is -S to identify the seed you wish to use, and that can be any number you desire. The next generative texture is the cell texture. Once I start using this, you're going to see some similarities to the Voronoi pattern, but it's still slightly different. I have this build selected as well as the grass below it. That way, when I run this command, you'll be able to see how it applies to a 3-dimensional shape and a flat shape at the same time. I'm going to start typing out ezTexture cells, and then we're going to enter our masks. We just want to, again, replace everything except air. And once again, we will pick a palette. I will again choose the grayscale palette. This is a little different from the previous noise texture because the palette it's using isn't actually going to be as obvious. You could get away with using 2 blocks instead of a full palette because the gradient doesn't apply that much. Next is the amount of cells. You can actually define how many cells in your texture you want to make. I'm going to just say 20 for now, and then I'll run that command and see what we get out of it. This is a good representation of how it looks on a 3D shape and on a flat surface. So a palette of blocks might not even be necessary because the gradient doesn't show up a whole lot on this, but if you combined it with other textures, it could be quite useful. Let's see how this would look with even more cells added. So let's try tripling that and going to 60. The scaling for the cells is determined by the amount of cells in your selection. The more cells you have to cram into a limited space, the smaller they are going to be. Following the amount, you can enter a brightness and contrast of this. Lowering the brightness by a negative number is actually going to make the lines a little bit thicker in between each cell. So that's a nice little cheat if you want to thicken the lines between cells, just lower the brightness. Contrast will kind of do the opposite, so if I do add some contrast to this, it's probably going to make those lines a little bit thinner again, so they will balance each other out. Something else that I've also discovered is if you have a negative contrast, it will invert all of the colors, which is interesting. A couple flags we have for this command are the -s to set the seed of your cell generation. So if you want to use the same seed more than once or found a seed that you really liked and you didn't want it to move, you can always define it that way. The other flag is -r for repulsion factor. It's going to change the way the cells are distributed, and the default value for this is 5. So I will show you how it looks with a larger and smaller value. If you did a smaller value of 1, the distribution is going to be much more uneven with some smaller cells mixed with larger cells and a lot more irregular shapes all throughout. If you set the repulsion factors to something much larger, like 10, they're going to start to even out a little more and be a little bit more uniform in size. The next generative noise type is the ezTextureFlow. And before I get into this texturing command, I do want to say that there are other ezEdits commands called flow field and flow line. They're very similar, but also a little different. ezTextureFlow will only affect surface blocks, unlike ezFlowField and ezFlowLines. I'm not going to get into the specifics for these two commands since I'm only focusing on the ezTexture commands, but just know that there are others similar to the ezTextureFlow. Maybe I can cover them in more depth in a separate video. Because ezTextureFlow only affects surface blocks, you need to make sure that you also have air in your selection for it to be able to detect those. I will go ahead and hide my selection for now because it is a little bit distracting. Following ezTextureFlow, you're going to enter a mask, like we always do. Let's just do everything except air. Now, you don't have to use a palette here, I found out. And that probably applies for all of these texturing commands. You could use any combination of blocks that you wish to use. It's just that palettes in general are the main reason for using these texture commands, is so you can insert your own gradient of blocks. But for sake of demonstration for the ezTextureFlow, I'm going to start with just a single block of diamond, just to pick something, just so I can use this to demonstrate exactly what it's doing. If I just do the default like that, let me just see what it's going to create. Oh, interesting. It's actually going to generate a bunch of flowing lines based off of a noise type, and it's a little hard for me to explain, but I will try my best. Following the palette or the blocks you're using, there is exposure. By default, the exposure is 0.6, and the exposure controls the density of the flow lines. So the smaller this number is, if I did 0.06, it's going to be placing fewer lines down. So that is what exposure means. Exposure is just the number of lines. You need a really small number in order to get just a few lines placed. If I did something much bigger, like 1, you're going to get a whole bunch of lines in there. The next number is iterations, which is essentially how long those lines are going to travel for. By default, it is 32, but if I set it to something smaller, like 10, you're going to get a series of short lines. So if I set this to 60, I'm going to get longer lines. Hope that's making sense so far. Following iterations, you have velocity, which is the speed at which the points are traveling. The default value is 0.5. If I make this go a little faster, like 1, I don't see much of a difference there. If I do 2, I can see a little bit of a difference, but if I do 3, the difference is clear because there are now gaps in between each iteration, showing me that they are moving faster. Taking all of this now known information, I'm going to do this command again using a regular palette instead of a single block. So I'm going to set the exposure, that is the number of points we're starting with. We can keep that at the default of 0.6 or 0.5, whatever, something small. Iterations, let's keep that at something like 60. Velocity, how fast are these points going to travel? We can keep that at something standard like 1. The next parameter is the palette index scaler, which scales the value of your palette. Another way to think about it is the brightness of your palette. So a higher value for this will shift the colors in your flow lines to the end of the palette. A lower value will shift everything more towards the beginning of your palette. You can also define what noise type your flow field is being based off of. By default, it is the Perlin noise type, but you're welcome to experiment with any of the noise types and see what kind of results you can get. I think these generative noise commands aren't something you necessarily need to know, but you can get some really interesting effects by experimenting with these commands. There are also a few flags that you can enter for this flow texture. The first one being -F, and this is simply going to fill in all those gaps. You see how the last few times I entered this command, it didn't fill in everything in my selection, but using -F will fill in all the gaps with the lowest block within your palette. The -G flag will apply gravity points, pulling your flow lines in a specific direction. So if I did something like east, it's going to kind of make them all travel towards the east. In general, it's kind of got that general pull of gravity to it. I haven't messed around with a lot of these to know exactly how effective they are, but yeah, you can experiment with them and see how they work. The last flag, -M, is the point momentum weighting. This one might be easier for me to show with a single block once again. So let me go back to just a single block, and we can keep all of these values. When you adjust the point momentum weighting, what it's basically doing is smoothing the direction that the lines are flowing. Without the flag, you're going to get very curved lines that follow the noise type that this is referencing. But the higher value that you place here, the lines will end up looking a little straighter. If you have a value of 1, you're going to get a very straight line because each new iteration is looking at the previous iteration and basing its momentum off of that. If you enter a very low weighing value like 0.05, it will still be curving, but the curve will be a little bit less than it usually is. That is my very rough explanation of easy texture flow. When applying this to an actual build, it's only going to be affecting the surface blocks of your build, so it's not doing anything on the inside. Here's a tip when it comes to any of these ezEdits textures, not just for flow, but I'm using flow as an example. You do have the option of using air to carve out shapes instead of just texturing them. When placing air with the flow texture, you'll get some very interesting carves within a mountainous shape. This is not the best example of it, but at least you can see what it's doing. I also set a random seed to it so I could run the command multiple times to make the crevices a little bit deeper. Swapping out the air for a regular palette of colored blocks is simply going to color the mountains now. While the carved shapes aren't extremely noticeable in this example, remember this is something that you can do with any of the texturing types. Experimenting with all of the various texturing tools is a lot of fun, but also very time consuming. I have easily spent hours doing it just for this video, and I've barely scratched the surface. Once you are familiar with all of the different texturing types within ezEdits, you can introduce yourself to the Easy Texture Advanced. I'm not going to explain this one in great detail, that is what the wiki is for. You can go on there and read all about how it works. But essentially, what it allows you to do is combine multiple textures inside a single command. Any of these textures that exist within ezEdits, I could combine. I could do an ambient texture combined with a sunlight texture. I could do a flow texture combined with a blocklight texture. However you want to define them and combine them, possibilities are endless. You can apply different blend modes for how the textures will blend with each other, as well as defining each individual parameter of each texture. If a parameter isn't defined, it will use the default settings, per usual. While it might not be a command that you use frequently in your builds, if you really are a nerd about texturing, it's a fun one to learn. I think that covers everything. There's plenty of other tutorials where this one came from. Hope you learned something and have fun building. Wow, so easy.